In this chapter, we're going to be tackling the central nervous system. Now, main parts of the central nervous system are really going kind of, it's called central for a reason. It's going right down the middle. Brain, brainstem. Now, the brain itself, kind of, some fun fact. It weighs around 3.5 pounds, and it is split into 4 different regions. And again, this is an adult brain, fully developed brain. It's split into 2 cerebral hemispheres. Sometimes they're also called the cerebral cortex. Sometimes they're just shortened and called the cerebrum. It's divided into the diencephalon, that purple structure on there. It's divided into the brain stem, which has further divisions, the midbrain, the pons, and medulla, and then the cerebellum, that kind of orangish area at the back. We're going to look at these different regions and what do they do? What do they control in our brain? So we're going to start with the cerebral hemispheres. Again, you have 2 of them. You have a left one and you have a right one. The left one generally controls your language, your math, your logic. The right one's more emotional, visual, spatial, musical. They still chat with each other. They are still connected, although they do have a pretty deep fissure between them. There are still fibers that connect the 2 together, so they can still, communicate one side to the other. The diencephalon is big purplish region on that one image. Has 3 paired structures. One for each side of the brain, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And it encloses a ventricle, so an area that you're going to store some of that cerebrospinal fluid. Looking inside of here, the hypothalamus is all this kind of purplish area. We've got this purple, we've got this is the hypothalamus, and we have the epithalamus over here. Now the thalamus, which I always think kind of looks like the egg-shaped, and yes, you've got one on each side of the brain. It makes up of 80% of the diencephalon. It's the largest part of the diencephalon. It's the gateway to the cerebral cortex, meaning information has to go through it before it actually goes to those outer parts of the brain. And because it has to go through it before it goes to the outer parts of the brain, it sorts information, it edits what's coming in, and it relays to where that information needs to go. I always think of the thalamus as the triage. When you go to the doctor, you first see a triage nurse. They figure out all the information that you give them, and then they figure out where you should go next. It also helps mediate some of our sensation, our motor activities, waking up our cortical systems, some of our learning, some of our memory. So it does a lot of things for that middle part of the brain. The hypothalamus kind of sits forward and underneath. It's called hypo, underneath the thalamus. It also has a wide range of functions, but all of them extremely important. Biggest one, it controls our autonomic nervous system, the things that we don't have any control over. Again, autonomic sounds like automatic, so we don't have any control over it. Helps control our blood pressure, our heartbeat, our digestive tract, our pupils. It can also respond physically to different emotions, whether you're scared or angry. It can help regulate your body temperature by triggering sweating and shivering. It can help regulate whether you're hungry or if you're full. And it can also help regulate water balance and when you're thirsty. So a lot of different things happening. The epithalamus sits near the back, and the main things we find in there, we find the pineal gland that hangs off there. The pineal gland secretes a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin is the hormone that helps regulate your sleep-wake cycles, so that when the lights go off and it's been a long day, more melatonin is triggered to be made and you get tired. That allows you to sleep. Now the brainstem is the 3rd region of the brain, and it's divided into the midbrain, the pons, this kind of expanded region, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain that happens right here is the midbrain, is right between the diencephalon region and the pons below it. Its main jobs help with pain suppression. It helps with visual reflex centers, auditory relay centers, and then it also is linked to the basal nuclei, controlling some of our motor control or muscle control. And so I always think, well, it's, in the middle of the brain, hence its name. And and it's not too far where your ears would be, so it's part of an auditory relay. And then your optical nerves also going right there, so it's there for your visual reflexes as well. The pons, that expanded region that sits below it, also connects the higher brain centers above it to the spinal cord below it, and so it relays information. But one of its kind of big things, it helps maintain your normal breathing. And like, so if your normal breaths per minute, if you're exercising, it's going to be triggered to go up. If you're sleeping, it's going to be triggered to slow down. So it helps regulate your normal rhythm of breathing. And then the medulla oblongata, right below that, has a lot of different functions, and all of them, if this particular region of the brain becomes damaged, damaging the medulla oblongata, because of what it can control, is always fatal. One, it has some functions that overlap with the hypothalamus, controlling some of those autonomic nervous systems, like your heart rate, your respiratory system, your breathing being triggered. It affects the heart. It affects the force, the rate of your heart contraction. It controls your blood vessel diameter and blood pressure. It controls your respiratory rhythm, the rate and depth of breath. It works with the pons. Couple other, it's those reasons why if it becomes damaged, it becomes fatal. But it also has some additional centers. It also can help regulate vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and even sneezing. You can blame on your medulla oblongata. And then the fourth region of the brain is the cerebellum, this big expanded region, kind of right tucked underneath, posterior to the brain. And it's hanging out right behind the pons, right behind the medulla oblongata. Now, it takes information from the cortex, it takes information from the brainstem, it takes information from the sensory receptors, and it puts it all together to really help coordinate skeletal movement. So if we need to take all that information and we need to tell our body to do something physically, whether it's dance or walk or run or whatever it is, it allows our body to take lots and lots of cues from our outside environment and allow for smooth, coordinated movements of your skeletal muscle. Now, if we cut open that cerebellum, the inside of it kind of looks branched. It's called the arbor vitae, which is a type of bush, a little, I'll say evergreen bush, and it's because it has these branches and kind of these little lobes on it, which is what those trees look like. Now, it also has some cognitive functioning. It's not just controlling your skeletal movements to make them nice and smooth flowing. It also helps us with thinking, with language, with emotion, and then comparing expected output to, your actual output with the expected output and adjust accordingly. An example on that, if you go on a boat and all of a sudden the boat's moving or tilting one way or another, you have to adjust your balance to, coordinate with that so you don't always fall over. Now, a little review, the pons belongs to which major brain region? It belongs to the brainstem. Severe damage to which of the following is always going to result in death? It's always the medulla oblongata because of those very important things it can do. And professional ballet dancers have a particularly efficient cerebellum that controls those nice, smooth flowing muscle movements. And yes, the more you practice, the more you can increase those smooth flowing muscle movements. Now, the part B are some other additional regions in the brain. Now, so some different parts of the brain, some different parts of the central nervous system and what they control. And one of these unique systems, it's not its own lobe or region because it actually goes in and innervates several regions, is called the limbic system. So it's on the medial aspects, meaning it's going out to the outside. Well, it's in the middle of the brain, but it does go into the cerebral hemispheres and goes around the diencephalon in the middle. It includes parts of the diencephalon, includes some of the cerebral structures. It goes down into the brainstem. It's all of that pink in there. But there's several things that our limbic system can control as it kind of goes in and weaves in these different systems of the brain. One of the big things that it plays a role in is emotions. And so it can recognize various facial expressions. When you look at someone and realize that they're angry or they're afraid, it can help us express our own emotions with different types of gestures. It can put emotional responses to different types of odors that if you smell skunks, you've got an emotional response to, that's really bad. Or if you, smell a particular perfume and you think of your grandma and you get sad or you get happy or whatever it is. We can put emotional responses to different types of odors. Now, it also interacts with the prefrontal lobes, the front part of the brain, and so it allows us to react emotionally to things we consciously understand to be happening, which means people are crying at funerals. Like, we consciously know what's going on and there's going to be some type of emotional reaction. We can also be consciously aware of emotional richness in our lives, meaning that you can realize that, you've got it pretty good and you're a happy person. You realize that you are emotionally enriched, and I'm like, and you're a happy person. Now, also part of the limbic system is its own separate little area called the hippocampus and I'm always going to say this wrong, amygdaloid body, which help us play a role in memory. It allows us to store memories. It allows us to link memories to even smells and to other emotions. Now, lots of very important things in the brain. Obviously, if we damage regions of the brain, it can definitely be fatal. So we do have to protect the brain. And there are several things that allow our brain to have lots and lots of protection. It's not one thing. 4 things allow us to have protection of the brain. Big one is we have the skull. That's a nice hard bone to protect the brain. Underneath that, we have meninges, various coverings that protect the brain. We have cerebrospinal fluid that covers the brain. And we also have a blood-brain barrier, so not everything that gets into your blood supply is going to affect or damage the brain. Now, the skull talked about in the skeletal system. We're going to go right into the meninges, which are talked only about in the nervous system. So the meninges cover and they protect the central nervous system. That includes the spinal cord as well. It protects all the blood vessels that are going to bring oxygen and nutrients to the brain. It encloses any of the venous sinuses that are containing extra cerebrospinal fluid. They contain cerebrospinal fluid themselves, and they do form little partitions in the skull. So it allows our skull to have little areas. There are 3 layers, starting from the outside working in. The dura mater is the most durable. Its word means tough mother. And I'm like, dura is durable or tough, and mater means mother. Now, pia mater, I'm like, arachnoid mater, yes, and I'm like, it means mother, it also means spider. Main reason why it gets the spidery name to it is that if we look at it, it does kind of have these little wispy things that come off of it. So the dura mater is this outer really tough layer. The arachnoid mater is this kind of wispy structure underneath. And then the last one, the pia mater, is the one that's actually attached to the brain or attached directly to the spinal cord itself. And pia means delicate, so it means delicate mother. It's the thinnest, and I'm like, it's impossible to remove because it's so thin. Now, if any of these become inflamed for whatever reason, whether it's bacterial, viral, something else, it's called meningitis. We have an inflammation of these meninges. This is showing these different meninges, same thing, but on the brain. That you're going to have your dura mater on the outside, the toughest one. You're going to have the arachnoid mater, and this is the dura mater. It's very thick. The arachnoid mater has those little wispy things coming off, and the pia mater is that really thin part attached directly to the brain. Now, I already said dura mater, strongest layer, has 2 sub-layers below it that allow it to be extremely tough. I'm like, in lab, we can even see some of this. It's a very tough material. And I'm like, to access the brain, you have to cut it and kind of peel it away, and it's easy to do. Underneath that is that arachnoid mater that has little web-like extensions. It's separated from the dura mater by what's known as subdural, it's below the dura mater space, and there's a thin film of fluid that's found in there. The subarachnoid space, where you find all those little wispies, contains cerebrospinal fluid and the largest blood vessels of the brain. Now, that also means they are poorly protected, as the arachnoid mater itself is fine and elastic, but we do have large blood vessels of the brain that still luckily are protected with the dura mater and the skull itself. This is showing, I'm like, here you have that arachnoid mater, and you've got some various large blood vessels found in there. Well, there is a little fluid in there too, provides some cushion. It's no protection. And then the pia mater, that's the most delicate. That's the one that's attached directly to the organ itself, whether it's directly to the brain or whether it's to the spinal cord. Lots of tiny little blood vessels found in there, but it's impossible to remove it when you're looking at the brain. But it's so thin, it's not that you can't see any other parts of the brain with it there. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid is also something that helps protect the brain. The composition, it's a water-based aqueous solution. It originates from our blood plasma, which is highly water. It doesn't have, the exact same composition as our blood plasma. It has less proteins. It's got different ions in there. But we always maintain a constant volume. Blood plasma can very much vary depending on your diet, depending on your hydration. Cerebrospinal fluid is not going to change. We're not going to become dehydrated and then lose the composition or lose the volume of your cerebrospinal fluid. The functions of the cerebrospinal fluid gives buoyancy to the brain itself. It reduces the weight of your brain by 97%. So that it floats more. It's not so heavy. Again, you would have this big, heavy structure sitting in there, moving around. And anytime you moved, the brain would move and your head would constantly be bouncing around. It does protect the nervous system from blows so that you can bump your head on something and that brain has got a fluid that it's sitting in, so it's not going to always be bumping against your skull. And it does have different nutrients in it. It does have some proteins. It does have ions, so it can carry chemical signals. It nourishes the brain. It can carry hormones to trigger the brain for something else, including the melatonin to make us sleepy. This is showing all of the blue on there is showing where we can find cerebrospinal fluid. And it's constantly floating around. It's constantly moving from in different regions of the brain. Lots of it made right here in the middle in that Diencephalon region. It's constantly moving all around, and I'm flowing in and out. Now, the blood-brain barrier is our fourth way of protection. It helps maintain a stable environment for the brain. Again, there's lots of things we eat, there's lots of things we drink, and there's lots of drugs that we take for our everyday life, and we don't want everything that goes into our body to affect our brain because some of it could be toxic. And so this helps maintain a stable environment for the brain. That doesn't mean not everything can get through. It can. Alcohol can get through. We all know that alcohol makes you act different. That's because it can get through. But not everything gets through. And so it helps separate your neurons from some other blood-borne substances. This is showing that we've got your blood vessels, we have neurons, and we've got kind of this insulation around it. So anything in your blood has to travel a decent ways before it actually gets to your neuron to cause any type of change in the brain. Now, it's a selective barrier. So nutrients can move through it. Facilitated fusion requires a carrier protein. And but metabolic waste, proteins, toxins, most drugs, not all, most drugs, some different amino acids, and even potassium ions can't get through. However, fat-soluble substances, including alcohol and nicotine and anesthetics, can get through, which means they're going to have effect on the brain. It's a nice barrier so that we're not affected by everything we take. Your over-the-counter drugs are there to, help decrease inflammation somewhere, but they're not going to cause any type of serious side effect to the brain tissue. Now, the blood-brain barrier is absent in some areas, one of those being the hypothalamus because of the vomiting center that's there, and that's necessary to monitor the chemical composition of the blood. Meaning, if you affect the chemical composition of the blood too much, means too much of something got in the body, and it will trigger the vomiting to try to get rid of that something. Number one thing that causes that, alcohol. Alcohol causes a severe chemical composition in your blood, which triggers the vomiting center, and we want it to try to stop alcohol poisoning, which can be fatal. Now, which of the following, final review on here, which of the following brain systems is heavily involved in mediating emotional responses? The biggest one is the limbic system. Limbic system, big emotional response. And then why is the blood-brain barrier ineffective against alcohol? Main reason, alcohol is a lipid-soluble substance, and so it can get across that blood-brain barrier, which means it's going to make us act different.